So thank you, everyone, for coming to another Reltio community show. I'm Chris Detzel, and today we have special guest, Saurabh, and he's one of our senior product managers here at Reltio. And the topic today is leveraging data validation function to improve data quality, or DVF. So as usual, sorry.
No, sorry, Chris, continue. Actually,
Oh,
I'm
no worries.
having some difficulties with my laptop, but you can continue.
Okay. So the rules of the show, keep yourself on mute. All questions should be asked in chat, or feel free to take yourself off mute and ask those questions. We will be recording and are recording this show right now. And so we will push it out to the Reltio community with some follow-up in the next day or two. Interesting enough, we do have today's show leveraging data or leverage data validation function to improve data quality in Reltio. Tomorrow, if you missed the RDM call that we had a couple of weeks ago, we went deep into reference data management, but there were so many questions that we're going to have a show tomorrow and just answer some of those questions, and then other questions that you guys have, and that will be live as well. And then in the next 2 weeks, or next week, we have a call called Unleash Data's Competitive Edge, and DMB and Reltio will be there to do more of kind of this Q&A. I'll be your moderator. And then on the 9th, we will go deep into some new workflow development that the Reltio team has been working on. So, Saurabh, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully you share yours.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Looks like it's coming up, loading. Perfect.
All right. Okay. So, hi everyone. This is Saurabh Agarwal, and I'm a senior product manager at Reltio. I've been with Reltio for a couple of years now, and I look after the areas regarding the data unification, including survivorship. I also handle DVF and LCS, and I also take care of some of the console applications like data modeler, performance monitoring, tenant management, and so on. The purpose of this show was, I'm not sure if you guys have noticed, but over last few releases, we have made a lot of modifications and enhancements on the data validation function. So our goal is that, DVF or the Reltio native data validation framework becomes the de facto destination for you if you want to validate your data. Right now, a lot of those functions are not supported. So what happens is customers end up, or our partners, they end up creating LCAs, and then they use LCAs to validate their data before loading into Reltio. Our goal is that while the data is being loaded into Reltio, we perform the validations on Reltio. We let our customers choose whether they want to store the data with warnings or they want to reject this bad quality data before it loads into Reltio. So, but before we go into data validation functions, it is important that we also understand what LCAs are. LCA is also called as lifecycle action. So LCAs is the framework which a data validation function uses to implement the validations in Reltio. So the agenda is going to be that I'll first discuss, or I'll first give you an overview of what LCA is. Then we'll discuss a little bit about the DVF. And the primary focus of this session would be to give you or to show you in demo how those data validation functions are configured and how do they work, what happens behind the scenes, and things like that. All right. With that, I'll continue. And so this is so basically what LCA is also called as life cycle action. This is a framework that allows you to inject your custom code into Reltio. So not all the functionalities that you want to build on your data is supported in Reltio as now. So anything that is currently not supported in Reltio and you want to perform those operations, you can do it by injecting your custom code. You can create your own code. You can inject it at any point of time or during the life cycle of the object. So for example, if I post an entity, the entity gets created in Reltio. Then it looks for matching pairs and all. If it finds a good match, based on the match configuration, it might go and merge into another entity. So in this whole life cycle where you create an entity and then there's matching which happens, matching and merging which happens, and then probably down the line you want to delete that entity. So in this whole life cycle, there are like different points in this life cycle where you can inject your code. For example, before saving the entity, you might want to check for certain validations which are currently not supported in Reltio. So you can do those validations, and you can use the LCA framework to do those validations before the data is getting saved. Once the data gets saved and you want to perform some more actions on that data after it is saved and before it is merged, again you can use the LCA framework to do those kind of operations. So this is a framework which allows you to inject custom code depending on where you want to build that custom code into the object lifecycle. And these are some examples, like you can do this custom coding before creating, updating, or deleting. And this is supported for both entities and relationships. As of now, we support LCA implementations as native Java implementation. We call it the native LCA and the AWS Lambda functions. So the difference between these two is the native LCA or the Java implementation is that these, for example, you write a code, a Java code for doing some validations before the data is saved. Okay, so what you'll do is you'll prepare a jar file, you'll share that jar file with us. That jar file is, after the whole approval and certification process, that jar file is loaded into our Amazon S3 bucket. And from there, we inject that code uh, in the same runtime environment where the Reltio code is running. So assume that in the same runtime environment, there are other customers also using the same server. So in this scenario, what happens is your code becomes a little risky in terms of performance. For example, if you've written a code which is very complex and it consumes a lot of resources, then the other tenants which are using the same server, it can be problematic for them as it can impact the performance for those tenants. With AWS Lambda functions, the benefit is that these functions, they run on separate Java environments, so there's no risk of performance impact to the other tenants. So we always prefer that any LCAs that you implement, you do it using the Lambda functions. The way these LCAs work is that we've defined or we've configured 32 different hooks in the platform. For example, before save, validate, after save, and these are some of the most used hooks. And so these are all supported in Reltio. For whichever operation you want to call your custom code, you configure that hook for the entity. For example, if I want to build my custom code before saving the entity, I'll use the before save hook. And as part of the before save hook, I can then make a call to my jar file, perform all the operations that I want to perform, and then once the jar file is completed, the normal processing of the object continues. Similarly, we have other hooks also. There's a total of 32 hooks which are supported, like before merge, after merge, before you create reference attributes, before deletion, after deletion. And there's like a whole list of different hooks which are supported. And the complete list is available in the documentation. Specifically with the before save hook, uh, we also support something called the action type. So saving happens in a lot of different scenarios, right? For example, when I'm creating an entity, that is also a save. If I update an entity, that is another save. Merge, split, and all of these different scenarios, they are also a kind of a save operation. And for the end users or for the person who's building those LCAs, they might want to configure different logic for each of those save operations. So that is why we also expose something called the action type. And these are the different action types which are exposed. And you can build your custom logic using the action type for before save hook. Mhm.
So can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Does this extend to Google Cloud Functions?
Uh, so right now we are only supporting AWS Lambda functions, but
Okay,
native support for Google Cloud and Azure functions is on the roadmap.
thank you.
Yeah, right. Uh, so, so few things that we have to keep in mind when we're building LCAs is that this should only be employed when we want to perform synchronous operations. For example, when I'm before I save an entity, I want to perform certain operations. Okay. So in this scenario, I would want to do my the operations that I want to perform. It has to be a synchronous operation, right? In certain other scenarios where synchronous operation is not required, you can rely on the events that are streamed through the pipelines. So if you need to perform synchronous operations, that is when we recommend to use LCA, because depending on the complexity of the LCA and the operations that you're performing through the LCA, it has an impact on the performance. Okay, so for example, before I save an entity, if there's like a 2000 lines of code which does a lot of processing, calls an external API, gets some data, and so on. So when you're loading that entity, all of that time which this LCA will take to execute, that adds to the time uh, that it will take to load the entity finally. So overall, there's a performance impact, and that is why we recommend that you use LCAs only in the scenario where you need synchronous processing. And currently, we support LCAs developed with JDK 1.8, but this will be upgraded because recently we found out that Amazon is going to discontinue the support for JDK 1.8. So our team is currently working on identifying like what should be the right version that we should upgrade to, so as to get the optimal performance from the LCA. So we are doing that analysis and we'll soon share out recommendation to all the customers and the partners, notifying them that this is the new supported version of the LCA. Um, Also, another thing to note is that we are continuously enhancing the platform, right? For example, I know that there are a lot of LCAs which were written by a customer which involved validations using the source system. So they want to perform certain validations on the data only when the data is coming from a specific source. Now, in a previous release, the release which happened yesterday, 23.3, we enhanced the data validation function to support these kind of scenarios. Now, any LCAs which were doing this operation before 23.3, they can now be shifted to DVF. So basically, a recommendation is that you review your LCAs continuously. You look at what new features are being developed on the platform, and the recommendation is to use out of the box platform features rather than create LCAs. Okay, and another important point to note is that we strongly recommend to use Lambda functions instead of native Java code because of the certain issues that I explained earlier. But the benefit for our customers and partners is that if you're creating Lambda functions, it does not have to go through the whole certification process. If it is the native LCA, then the engineering team has to review your code to ensure that it does not, there's no security issues, the performance is optimal, and so on. But when you run it, when you create Lambda functions, this whole review process is scrapped. You can you can create your Lambda functions. We have a step-by-step guide to show you how these Lambda functions should be deployed and how they can be used in your code. And so the whole process of you connecting with the support team, sharing your LCA jar file, then somebody validates the code, and a lot of to and fro with the support team in ensuring that the LCA gets deployed. So all of that time is cut, and it makes it really easy and quick for you to deploy your own Lambda functions. If you want to make a change, you do a change, test it locally, and then deploy it. You don't really need to wait for the Reltio team to do any further processing on it. And at the same time, it also helps you in in easy debug and troubleshoot because you have the complete access on these functions. You have your own IT team which can extract the logs, share it with you. You can look at what needs to be corrected, troubleshoot the LCA, and then deploy it again. So overall, it makes it a lot easier for you as a customer and partner, and it is also easier for us, Reltio, in managing those Lambda functions. Mhm. So that was a brief overview about Lambda, and now I'll move on to what DVF is. So DVF is like a feature that we built in Reltio, which lets you validate your data when the data is getting created in Reltio, and it could be through any channel. I mean, it does not matter whether you're creating the data through UI or through data load, or you calling the direct APIs to create entities and relationships. But through any channel, when you're trying to create a data, TVF lets you validate that data based on the rules that you will configure, and uh, and then you can decide whether you want to still store the data with certain warning, or you want to reject that data from loading into Reltio. Internally, DVF uses the LCA framework. And so basically, when you define a data validation function, we create a before save hook, which calls the data validation function. And so internally, it uses the LCA framework. Uh, So based on the data validation
Hey,
functions
Saurabh,
that, yeah,
can I
yes,
ask a
yes,
couple
yes.
questions? Do you mind?
Yeah,
Um,
sure, go ahead.
are there any advantages or special things that LCA can do over Lambda functions?
No, there's no difference. So whatever functions that you can build using LCA, you can do that same thing using Lambda functions. The so functionality wise, there's no difference, but there's benefit in using Lambda function in terms of the ease of usage and deployment, because you have full control over those Lambda functions.
Okay. And one more question. For the customer who has Azure or GCP as their enterprise cloud provider, do they need to use Lambda function as well for LCA, or Azure functions for Google Cloud Functions will also be supported?
So what we do is for because we do not support native functions for GCP and Azure. So what we do is we help our customers build the Lambda functions and deploy it onto Reltio AWS account. Until we can support the cloud native for Google and Azure, we let them use the Reltio AWS account to create functions and use it.
Got it. Okay. And then one last question, I promise, and then we'll keep going. Can DVF function be used to validate new value based on current value of an attribute
New value based on the current value. Uh,
of an attribute?
No,
Yeah.
so what happens is the BVF only runs on the operational value. When you inject a value, or when you post an entity and you're trying to create an entity or update an entity, internally we first apply that entity, or we first create that entity
Yeah.
I mean, we don't persist it, but we create it, we find the operational value, and then run the data validation functions only on the operational value.
Okay. Karan, hope that helps.
So yeah, so the answer is no. You cannot use the old value of the attribute to validate the new value. That is not supported.
All right. So keep going. And some of these questions are being asked. I'm going to ask them later. So they're
Okay.
keep pushing them in, and I'll make sure to ask. Thanks.
All right, sure. So once you create your data validation functions, then after you've created your data validation functions, and then you start posting data in Reltio. So what happens is, depending on whether it is an error or warning, if it is a warning, we still let you store the data, but along with that data, we also store the warning message saying that, whatever warning message that you configure. Say, for example, you create a data validation function saying that the date of birth should not be greater than the date of death. Okay, for an HCP, this is the condition. But if you configure it as a warning, you might say that a warning message saying that correct the date of death, it should not be greater than the date of birth, and something like that. So in this scenario, if it is configured as warning, we will still store the data, but at the same time we'll store the warning message also. So when a user opens a profile, or when they get an entity using the APIs, they will see that there's a warning attached with this entity. And this storage of the warning messages or errors is done using the analytics attribute. I'll in a bit I'll show you how the L3 configuration looks like once we have configured the data validation function, where the hooks are added, and how these analytical attributes are added. We have pretty functional self-service capability, quite mature self-service capability that lets you create the data validation functions which are currently supported on the platform. So you don't really have to use the APIs to create these validation functions. You can use the self-service capability on the in data modeler in console. And until previous release, which is 23.2, we did not support validation on relationships. But in 23.3, we've enhanced DVF to also let you validate the relationship attributes. So when you're creating relationships and you want to do certain validations, for example, you have an HCP and an address, and there's a relationship, HCP and location, and there's a relationship of has address with the address type as a relationship attribute. So when you create this entire this entire HCP location and the relationship, you might want to put a validation saying that the relationship type should not be empty, should not be missing, right? And you create a warning message for that. So now you can do these kind of validations even on the relationship attributes, which were not supported until few days back. There's a choice to discard or save with warning any bad quality data. And you can also choose whether you want to perform these validations only during create, only during update, or for both. So whether the validation should run only when you're creating new data or when you're updating an existing data, or you want to run those validations in both the scenarios. And then you can create, or you can define the message which should be displayed to the end user when any of these validations fail. And uh, the last point is that so you already have your tenants and there's a lot of data already existing. Now, as we enhance our data validation features and you want to create or update the existing data validation functions, you can rerun the validation task, and that validation task will perform the validation on all the existing data. So every time you create a new validation function or update an existing validation function, you would have to run the validation task so that the existing data also gets validated. And this validation task is now supported for both entities and relationships. Uh, I'll move on to demo, Chris. So if you want to ask other questions, we can do that first.
Okay, well, here we go. There's plenty. So let me start with the notes. Is it possible to create a DVF on attribute A based on value of attribute B?
Yes, it is possible.
Okay. Any other thoughts there, or it's just possible?
No, it is possible. And as part of the demo, I'll show some of these
Okay.
scenarios, how you can use different attributes to validate your data.
Perfect. So can DVF initiate email notifications, etc.?
No, it does not. At the moment, it is not supported. But we do have requests from quite a few customers who want this kind of capability. And it is on a roadmap. So we plan to build it in future.
Yeah, that's a good one. So go vote, I think, is kind of the important thing on the ideation portal. Can the DVF be run on the OV value of a particular survivorship group?
Actually, yes. So OP is calculated. Sorry, just let me give it some thought.
What's that?
So when the data is getting posted, at that time, depending on the user group, or for example, if the survivorship which is being used is the default survivorship, that is what will calculate the OV. And at that time, the data validation function will run on that OV. So depending on which user creates the data or updates the data, I think it will work, but I need to test it to be sure.
Okay.
Because see, the operational values are calculated on if you are survivorship group, you're part of a group with specific survivorship strategies. And when you post the data, the survivorship values or the OV values will be calculated based on which group you are part of. And the data validation function would run on those operational values.
Okay. Thank you. And can DVF work as standardization functions as well? So for example, can I use it to change the data to make it in the standardized format?
No, we don't support that. So there's no update of data. It is only validating the data and flagging the data within that time.
What's that? Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so right now there's no capability to update the data. We only validate the data and flag it as error or warning.
Okay, great. Can you please give some examples, and maybe you will, of which validations are currently not there in Reltio for which customer needs to use LCA or DVF? I mean, I
Yeah,
don't know if
so
that's, go ahead.
yeah. So some of the things which are on our roadmap, and we have requests from customers to support those, and I can give you some of those examples. For example, we cannot validate the reference attributes as of now.
Okay,
So if you have defined reference attributes in your entity, we do not support data validation functions on reference attributes. So right now, our customers either use LCA or they configure reference attributes as relationship. They use it as relationship, and then specifically for cardinality, they use the attribute cardinality for relationships. We don't support cardinality on relationships right now as part of DVS. And there are few other, I mean, like we do not have support for GCP functions and Azure functions. So there are a lot of things which are on the roadmap which are currently not supported. But you'll see that gradually we'll keep on enhancing the DVF to at least cover most of those common scenarios which our customers have to use right now. Another thing to note is that DVF is only supported for before save hooks. So if you want to perform validations before saving your data, that is when you can use DVF. But if you want to perform certain validations, for example, before deleting the data, okay, before you delete the data, you might want to check that there should be no active relationships on this entity. So right now that is not supported through DVF.
okay, thank you. And can we discard attribute value if validation fails?
If the validation fails, we cannot discard the attribute value, we can discard the whole entity. So I mean, if you try to, say for example, if you're trying to load data through data upload and there's a data validation function which fails, it was defined as error, the whole entity would not load. And in the output file, you receive a response saying that, why this was not loaded, what was the problem with that data. So that way you can correct the data and load it again.
Okay, so I think this might be a comment from Shiva Putra. For standardization, customer can use cleanse. I think that's a comment, or I'm not sure if that's a
Yeah.
question, but okay.
Right. So for standardization, I mean, if you want to, for example, if you want to standardize your email or the address, we have the cleanse service. For example, for address, we use the locate cleanse. So for some of those standardization, you can use our cleanse services. We support it for email, phone, name, thing cleaner, and things like that. So yeah, I mean, go through our documentation, read about cleanse, and a lot of standardization is supported through cleanse.
Okay. How can we reprocess the failed records in DVF?
You can rerun the revalidate job. So what happens is, say for example, you load a data, then you run the validation functions, and you identify that there are certain records which had warnings or errors. As you correct those records, those warnings and errors will go automatically. If you change your validation function and you rerun the revalidate job, the validations will be calculated again. And if those records do not have those validation errors still, then those validation messages will go.
Okay, a couple more questions. So is it true that default values cannot be set based on DVF? And are there any caveats with DVF? So for example, in some specific areas, DVF is not supported, so we don't have false expectations. Currently, all LCAs go through submission to Reltio for review
Yeah.
before production. Does that same apply to DVF?
Yeah, so DVF is supported natively on the platform. So DVF, if you create data validation functions, it does not have to go through any review from the engineering. And like I mentioned earlier, only native LCAs have to go through review by the engineering team because there are certain risks involved with the native LCA. If you are using Lambda functions and you're deploying it in your own AWS account, there's no review required. You can directly deploy your Lambda functions and start using it.
What is native LCA?
So native LCA is the Java code which runs in the Reltio's own Java environment. So
Okay.
I create a Java code, I write a Java code, then I create a jar file and then give it to Reltio to run it in Reltio's Java environment. That is called the native LC. But if you use it to run as Lambda functions in your own AWS account, then it does not have to go through because there's no shared environment for the Lambda functions. Every Lambda function runs on its own Java environment. So there's no risk of noisy neighbor where performance of one LCA is impacting other tenants, or there's no security risk involved. So that is why there's no review mechanism or review recommendation for the AWS Lambda function.
I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll continue with the demo, I promise. And then I'll ask more questions after the demo. So can DVF results exported via Reltio's API?
Uh, so on the search, if you can search for attributes which have data validation errors, and I can show it during the demo, and then you can export those through our export service. And if you're trying to load data through the import service, in that case, the output will give you the data validation errors and warnings for all the data which have those issues.
Thank you. And I'll ask
Um,
more questions later.
Just to expand on that response, when you get the entity, the DVF is returned with it. So if there's
Yes,
a DVF error, you will get that with the response.
right. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm. All right, so I'll continue. Like I promised earlier, so this is the entity called contact in my tenant. And once I create the first validation function on contact on this entity, you'll see that there's some extra lines of some extra configuration which is added in the L3. We add two lifecycle actions. One is before save, so it instructs Reltio to execute the validation functions which are created before saving any entity, and the other one is validate. And this validate hook is used for real-time validations when you view data on the UI. So if you have entities with errors and you try to open that entity in the UI, it would on the UI itself, it would perform a real-time validation of the data. It will execute all the data validation functions and show you the error message on the UI. So these are the two hooks which are added every time or the first time that you create a validation function on the entity, and the attributes which are used for storing the validation errors and warnings is called the analytics attribute. Within the analytics attributes, you'll find attribute validations nested attributes, and in this, these are all the attributes which are used to capture the validation errors. So what is the function URI, the function expression, what name is this validation function storing, validating, what action type, whether whether it's a warning or an error, and the actual validation message. So these are the changes that you'll see in your entity L3 configuration if you configure the LCs. And these same things are also added to relationships. So when you create a validation on the relationship attributes, in the relationship configuration, you'll see the same configuration added also for the relationship. So both relationship and the entity validation, they use the same framework of validating the data and storing the error messages. Okay. Uh, all right. So with that, I'll go to the demo. Um, so first, let's check out some of the validation functions for entities. I have this entity called contact. And when I select this entity in data modeler, you'll see there's a tab called validation functions. And in validation functions, now you have the option to create more validation functions or edit any existing validation functions. So what I'll do is I'll try to create new and we'll look at the different validations which are currently supported. So some of the metadata, like which attribute do you want to validate, what is the display name, if there's a description for this validation function so that the end user can, or so that the other users of data modeler can understand what this validation does. Then we have the validation level. whether it is warning or an error type of validation. If it is a warning, what it means is that we'll still save the data, but there'll be a warning attached to this data which is saved. If it is an error, then the data load or the data creation is rejected. Create or update. This validation event, it has three values, whether you want to perform this validation only during create or update, or both create and update. So depending on this configuration, this before save hook determines what is the action type, whether it is create or update, and then the data validation function is called accordingly. Then we have the function builder. In the function builder, you will see that all the user defined attributes for the entity, they are on top. Then we have something called the system defined attributes. These are the attributes like start date, end date, roles, and tags, which are not part of your data model, but still exist for all the entities. And then we also enhance the system to support validation based on the source system. Okay. So let's take one example. I mean, I want to validate that the full name uh, should not be missing. Okay. So what I'll do here is the validation function that I'll create is that the full name is missing. The way it is read is if the full name is missing, then this validation function will be triggered. So I mean, it's a little confusing to understand initially. If I want to validate that the full name should not be missing, I'll create a function to say that when the full name is missing, then trigger this error or warning, and the message could be so some message to notify the user that what is the error or warning and what you need to do to correct this error. Depending on which attribute you select here, this list of functions that we support also changes. Sorry, give me one second. Yeah, so depending on the attribute that you select, data type of the attribute that you select, you'll see that these validation functions are also different. If you're trying to validate attribute which is of data type string, then the functions are quite different from what you want to validate when it is a date. Right? For example, if it is a string, these are all the functions like contains, not contains, equals, considering case, in the list, and so on, fuzzy match, exact match, and so on. So all these different functions which are supported for string, and this function would keep changing depending on the data type of the attribute that you select. Uh, Another thing to note here is depending on what functions or what function you want to use for this validation. For example, I use equals. Okay. We also recently enhanced it. Earlier, you could with equals you could only enter a fixed value. For example, if I want to say the full name equals Saurabh, in that case, I mean, not a very valid scenario, but if I want to create a function, something like this, I can, earlier I could only do this, but now we've added something called the attribute selector to let you use the data validation functions for cross attribute comparisons. So I might want to put check that the first name equals to say the last name. If the first name is equal to the last name, then display a warning. So this attribute selector now lets you perform these comparisons among the attributes of the same entity. And then we have, I mean, to let you create all those complex rules, we also support and or operations. So you can, build multiple validation rules in the same function and create one complex validation function. So this was for a name for a string attribute. Let's take a look at some integer attribute. All right. So if it is an integer, again, like I mentioned, the validation functions that you want to use for integer is quite different than what you would expect for a string. And these are all the different functions that we support for integers: greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, less than, equal to, and so on. So here again, we have support for an attribute selector. So year of birth, if it is greater than, say, the year of death. If it is greater than the year of date, you might want to put a validation to ensure that the bad data does not get into Reltio. And with date, we again have like a separate set of validation functions that we support for date. For example, the activation date, again, depending on what function I choose here, for the date, you'll two switches here, the selector, which works exactly the way that it works for numeric and string values. You can choose, you can select an attribute, and here you can choose another date. So if the activation date is after the deactivation date, you can throw a warning or an error, and the other switches for the relative date. Okay, so you can now also validate it with respect to the current date when when this function is being executed. So if you set up this function for create and update both, so every time you create or update, it would validate the function with respect to the current date. So for current date, you leave it as 0. If you want to validate it against the future date, okay. So activation date, if it is after 5 days in future from the current date, you can set it to +5, or you can also set it to a negative value. So the activation date is after -5 days from the current date. So those kind of validations you can do here. And instead of days, you can also use months and or years. So for example, if you want to check that at the time of activation, uh, the age should be greater than say 25 years. So what you can do is you can set up this validation function for create, and you can choose the year of birth. If it is less than or before -25 years, then you throw an error. So these kind of complex validations we can perform using these lips. Any further questions, Chris? You want to go through some other questions now?
We do. Yeah. So some of those Gino went in to answer, but the ones he didn't, let's ask him. So are there specific roles needs to be set up for user access, like DVF functionalities, like review, correction, etc.?
No, there's no separate role. If the user has access to data modeler, they will be able to access data validation functions also.
Okay. We have seen a scenario where there are parent and child RDM values, and there are also two values for a field. So we don't get lookup errors. So now we use DVF. And there's a picture on there, but I don't know if you can see it.
I'm not sure if it will answer your question, but let me just. So one of the other enhancements that we did recently was with RDM lookup errors.
Yeah.
So if you have an attribute which is mapped to RDM value, you'll see that there are two additional options in the functions that we support. So country, and the two additional options is whether the lookup error exists or the lookup error is missing. So if you want to use the lookup error exists condition, you can also use it. What will happen is if you try to load a data and you enter a country which is not mapped to a proper lookup, which cannot be mapped to a proper lookup value, then this condition will trigger, and the validation function will execute basically.
Yeah. And by the way, we have we did a call last week around or 2 weeks ago on RDM. So I'll push that into the chat. And then we do have an Ask Me Anything around RDM tomorrow
Okay.
with one of the guys. So yeah, these analytical attributes created by modeler. That's just a comment, I think.
So no, it is not create. So internally we create it. I mean, the data
Oh.
modeler, the person individually does not have to go and update the L3 configuration. When you create the first data validation function for an entity, we also create the analytical attributes along with it while creating the DBF.
Great. Can we get this API collections? Is there a collection there that they can get?
I I think we um, Shiva or Thiru, can you answer that? I think we have a Swagger.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they are part of the
yeah,
Swagger documentation. Yes.
yeah.
Great. If you guys have it, would love for you just to post it, or send it to me and I can put it in the presentation. Perfect.
Yeah.
That way I can send it out to everyone.
Yeah, we do.
Thank you. Is there any limitation with in same attribute for nested attributes?
Uh, no, there's no
So,
limitation as such. The only thing is that it is currently not supported in the function builder. And what we do is there are like in same attribute is one such example, but we also do not support nested conditions in the function builder yet. And what we recommend our customers to do is they can switch to an advanced editor and they can enhance the function or they can enhance the data validation function in the advanced editor. So they can, anything which is not supported in the function builder can be or can be configured here in the advanced editor.
okay. Can you please advise if it's possible to create a complex conditions in DVF with grouping conditions using brackets?
Yeah, so again, it's not possible using the function builder, but you can
Oh.
always switch to the advanced editor and you can apply the complex conditions here.
Are these functions do they work the same way irrespective of the model? So UI, API, data loader, rocks, utility, SF
Yes.
connector, etc. Updated, it does. Okay,
Yeah, that's it.
good. That was easy. Can we call any scripting language from validation function? It looks like Gino answered that. And the answer is no, but regular expressions are
Yeah.
possible. Okay.
Yes, regular expressions are possible, and you'll see that option over here, regular expression.
Okay. And then are these, so trying to understand if there are limitations, are there any other limitations we should be aware of at this time?
Um,
That you know
yeah,
of?
so I mean, some I've already mentioned, like we do not support validation functions for reference attributes, for cardinality, for relationship validation using entity attributes. So there are certain things that we are not supporting right now, but anything which is supported and is available in the self-service configuration, uh, everything is supported which is here in the self-service configuration. So depending on your use case, what exactly you want to validate, I think we'll have to look at those examples and suggest whether it is supported or not.
So one of the questions is that it's not supported, and the question is this: can we create a DVF using two entity types in the same function? And I know it's not
No,
supported, but is there any
it is not
plan?
supported.
Is it in the
So
plan to do it or no?
I mean, we do have requests from customers to support it.
Yeah.
As of now, it is not supported because of a lot of technical complexity which is involved with it. So, I mean, to validate one entity, if we have to make another call to another entity,
Mhm.
what happens is that the performance of for example, if you're doing this validation function for creation or updation, and every time you load the data, the performance of the platform would go down because as the complexity of the DEF increases, it will take more time to validate that data. Any additional calls that we make to the database add to that overall time it takes. So right now we are struggling with how do we support most of the features without impacting the performance much, and that is where the discussions are happening right.
Okay. Is there any limitations with reg exp invalidation function? Sorry, maybe I'm not saying that right. It's maybe you
Is it
can take
with
yourself off
regular
mute.
expression?
Yeah, that's regular expressions, Chris.
Okay,
Yeah.
regular
So
expressions.
no, we support all the regular expressions. I mean, we suggest that you validate your regular expression before you configure it and test it in the tenant. But we support all kinds of regular expressions.
Okay. Can we reject incoming updates using VF?
Yes, we can. And the way to do it is you validation level would be set as error, and then here you can choose whether you want to do it only for update or update and create both, or only create.
So what happens when that error when we error it out? So like can we send a notification to the data owner, or is there any way to notify the data owner, or is it only visible from the DQ dashboard?
So if you are trying to load data through our import feature, you can download the output file, and the output file will have all the errors and warnings with each of the data that you loaded, with each record that you loaded.
That's in case of
There's
data
no
load.
in case of data load. If you're doing it through the API response will have the attributes. If you're doing it through the UI, you'll see the errors or warnings on the UI as you create and update your data. Right now, we do not have notification ability, but the user who's performing the action will be notified in near real time.
So, and you won't be allowed when somebody is creating a record and it says name is required, otherwise you won't be allowed, right? And it errors out. So it won't allow the person to save the record, right?
Depending on whether it is warning or error.
Yeah,
If you
if it is
set
an
it as,
error.
yeah, if it is an error, the customer won't be able to save it. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thanks,
Is there
sir.
thanks, Chandra. Are there any plans to have regular expressions like that to be used in match rules? I'm not sure you're the one to answer that, but it's a good question.
I'm not sure. Does anyone else? Can anyone else answer that? Maybe Tino or Thiru, Shiva.
Hey, Ujwal, you might just ask that particular question in the community, and I can get the PM to answer.
Yeah, no
If you-
problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I just know like when you're setting it like equals or like that little drop down, there isn't an option for regular expressions. Like yeah,
Mm.
regular expression match, there isn't an option for that in like match rules. So I was just curious if that's ever going to be
Yeah.
implemented.
So, oh, you want? So basically, are you asking that support of regular expressions in match rules, or?
Yeah, like in match rules, like if we want, I don't know, let's say like some attribute has the word test within it, and we don't want it like we don't want it to match or something, or we want to match it if it contains
Okay.
this word, then that it would be
Okay.
like regular expressions would make that possible.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I won't be able to answer it, but like what Chris suggested, post it on community, or I can get the match PM to get an answer for you on that.
Yeah, I think the best way is post a community so we know, so we remember, because we'll probably never remember just going through this. Within the advanced editor, will the system let the user know if there's a syntax typo when the function is getting saved?
Within the advanced editor, it would not. Yeah, so that is right now not. I mean, that is not right now foolproof, because in the advanced editor, the syntax validation doesn't happen. If it
I
is in
think
the
it's
function
there,
builder.
Saurabh. Maybe you can try it again if it will show immediately if you have some syntax problem.
Okay, I can maybe quickly try it now.
Even we do have kind of regular phishing violation also.
Yeah,
No,
so
it's syntax
I
error.
think
It's
it
a
is.
syntax error. When you say syntax error, let's say you are misplacing one bracket, like that.
Yeah. Okay, it allowed me to save, but then it also says invalid expression.
Okay.
I missed a bracket. I just added one bracket. I did not add the closing bracket. So. Yeah, so I think we need to relook at this. I mean, if it knows it's a invalid expression, maybe we should not have allowed to save it.
Okay.
So thanks for
On
bringing
the
it up.
API side, we
I'll
have this validation.
okay.
I love it. On the fly kind of working session. So we have a few more questions, only 4 minutes. So there might be an opportunity to do like an Ask Me Anything on this because there's so many questions, but let's see if we can get through some of these. Is it on your roadmap to set value, say, based on DVF output? So for example, say incoming value doesn't fall into specific defined values. If so, set default value, understood setting value is not supported today.
Yeah, so default value currently we only support a fixed value for default value. This conditional default value is not supported.
Okay.
And we do not have, as of now, we do not have any plans to build it in the product.
Great.
Okay.
Go
Do
ahead.
you want to continue with questions? I just wanted to show a couple of more things. I mean,
Yeah,
we've
go ahead.
covered some of the scenarios. Okay, so some of the things that we recently added was also support of this system-defined attributes like the start date, end date, roles, and tags, and the source system name. So source system name is one which was like requested by quite a few customers. I'll take one example. You want to validate that the dunce number should not be missing for an HCP. Okay, you create an HCP and you want to validate that the dunce number should always be present. But the dunce number only comes from DNB source. Okay, so now you want to run this validation only when the entity has data from DNB source. Until now, you could not do it. I mean, if you create it, until now there was no support for source system. So if you create this validation that the dunce number cannot be missing, then it would trigger an error as soon as you create a profile, even though the profile has not received any data from DNB, but it throws an error. So basically, it was, it was unnecessary notification or unnecessary work for the data receivers to go and check that record and then say that, okay, because it does not have DNB and that is why it is flagged. But now with this source system, you can do those kind of validations also. So you can mention that, the dunce number is missing and source system is, so this is how the source system would be, and the source system say equals and DNB. So in that case, it will validate that only when the source system is DNB, then check whether the dunce number is missing or not. And similarly, if you have roles defined in your entity, for example, it's an HCP, and then you have certain roles like orthopedic or pharmacist or all those different roles, and you want to run your validations on specific role. For example, if it's an employee and organization, and you want to run a validation that the only when an employee, the title should not be missing. Okay, so you can use the roles in your in your validation function, and it will list all the roles that are currently present for this entity, and you can choose or you can create the validation function accordingly. So I did wanted to show some of these. I mean, I wanted to cover more stuff. How to show you how the validation functions now appear on the UI. What you need to do to ensure that you can see the validation function on the UI. But I guess we do not have enough time.
So
just one quick. Okay,
ahead.
sorry, Chris. Go ahead.
Go
No, you go ahead while this
Yeah, look,
page is open.
unfortunately, we don't have time to go through this, but I did ask Saurabh, and maybe we can do an Ask Me Anything. I don't know if, I'll get with you offline to try to find some time with you, but it sounds like I asked people to vote, just threw something out there, and there's 6 or 7 people that said yes. So maybe there's some time that we can show this piece and a couple of the other things, and then just have a session on Ask Me Anything. So 10, 15 minutes of this demo, and the rest would be just Ask Me Anything. Just, the questions that didn't get answered here, which 3 or 4, and we know how these things go. I mean, people will ask a ton of stuff. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, Chris.
Great. Look, everyone. I mean, we took this whole entire hour on this topic. Seems like there was lots of questions. So yeah, now there's like 10 or 12 people that are liking this and wants to ask me anything. So thank you everyone for those questions. This is going to be recorded or has been recorded. I'll post it tomorrow, the next day, to the community. I'll send kind of a follow-up email to everyone, and then I'll talk to Saurabh to do an Ask Me Anything in the next week or so. I know some vacations and things like that in India are coming up. So I don't know how all that is going to play out, but we'll definitely have an Ask Me Anything. So thank you everyone for another great session. And Saurabh, thank you so much. Lots of great questions here and lots of good information here and lots of interest.